Thanks, Alyssa. Hey, everyone. I am Leah M. Forney. I am the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate and Training Assistant here at MCASA. And so, welcome to Serving Sexual Assault Survivors from Underserved Populations. So, over these next 90 minutes, I make a few promises to each and every one of you. One is that you're going to walk away having the ability to define and describe underserved populations and how they're impacted by sexual violence with an intention on their identity, systematic oppression, and the unique barriers they face. Two, you're going to be able to develop an understanding of their unique lived experiences and how their needs are way different when it comes to support and how trauma shows up. And three, I'm going to leave you all with some practical advocacy strategies using the socio-ecological model and how we can begin to promote survivor-centered, culturally responsive, and equitable services. So, as a quick overview, what we'll discuss today is underserved populations. We'll talk a little bit about identity. We'll talk a little bit about the incarcerated survivors. We'll talk a little bit about oppression and trauma. We'll even talk a little bit about the barriers to access. And then we'll wrap up with how do we move forward. So we'll touch on the socio-ecological model and equity. So to kick us off, I want to hear from you all first, and I have a quick little icebreaker. So if you had one advocacy superpower, what would it be and how would you use it? So an example can be instantly gaining trust. Let me know in the chat, what would be your advocacy superpower? To heal pain. I like it. Have all resources they need at hand. To say the right thing perfectly every time. Okay. Prevent extended trauma. I like that. Be supportive at all times. To stop it from happening in the first place. Awesome. What else do we got? Ability to immediately understand preferred communication styles. I love it. Yep. What else? Instantly provide empowerment, provide the resources they need, and provide necessary financial needs. Awesome. Awesome. Great superpowers. Okay, so let's talk about the underserved populations. Who are they? Right? And so, what does it mean when we're discussing underserved populations? Well, the first thing I want to know is that we know that sexual assault survivors as a whole are underserved, right? And so sexual violence is 100% preventable, yet we know it still happens every single day to people of all identities and all backgrounds. We also know that all sexual abuse survivors experience barriers to the justice and the healing that they deserve. But today we're going to talk about the survivors who face additional barriers and additional trauma solely because of their intersecting identities. These survivors may be underserved by our organizations because of our cultural attitudes and beliefs about their identity, our individual lack of awareness, and understanding of their identity and systematic oppression of the people who hold that identity. So let's talk about identity. The first thing I want you to know is that this is not an exhaustive list, right? And it does not go in any particular order. When we're talking about identity, we're talking about a social construct, right? And so I'm going to briefly go through some of these categories and give you some examples of how they play a role with underserved populations. So the first one is age. Age is also one aspect of our identity. So when we're talking about age, we're typically talking about younger versus older, right? But also with age comes cultural views and how we treat people of different ages, right? In different ways. So, for example, in our European cultures, not all elderly people are highly respected, right? In many cases, they may live separated from the younger generation. They may oftentimes feel lonely. They typically get less visitors if they live in like a nursing home or an assisted living facility. Yet in our Asian cultures, right, getting old is seen as a positive thing. And oftentimes, elderly people in that culture are respected and they're cared for by their children. Another aspect of our identity is race. So we know race is a socially constructed category. And so when we're talking about race, we typically are talking about skin color. So black, brown, white, mixed race, biracial, multiracial. And then we have ethnicity. So when we're talking about ethnicity, we're talking about cultural, shared heritage, and language. So some examples of that can be Latinx, Pacific Islander, Afro-Caribbean, European American. Now, it's important to know that when it comes to ethnicity, it is not necessarily tied to race. It's also not necessarily tied to geography, right? But it's more focused on culture, right? And so when we're looking at ethnicity, we can also be looking at things like the Jewish community or the deaf community, right? Then we have national art origin. So national origin is where we get into the geography, right? We assess where is a person born, where were they raised, or where do they have cultural ties to. So our national origin can include things like their country of birth. An example of that can be Haiti, Mexico, Nigeria. We can also look at things like our ancestral homeland or nationality, right? And some examples of that can be Australian, German, Japanese. All of those are national origin. Now, when we talk about skin color, we're talking about things like light skin, dark skin, brown skin. It's important to know that skin color oftentimes intersects with racial identities. So, for example, someone can be black and light skin, someone can be black and dark skin, someone can even be of Asian descent and be light skin, or Asian descent and dark skin. Someone can also be albino, which means they have non-pigmented skin and still identify as Black, both racially and culturally. Then we have disability. Now, disability encompasses a broad range of physical, sensory, cognitive, dis- developmental, neurological, psychiatric, and invisible conditions that shape how individuals experience the world and how the world responds to them. So here are some examples. With physical disabilities, it can look like things like mobility impairment. So maybe someone is experiencing paralysis or chronic pain condition, for an example, like lupus. For sensory disabilities, it can include things like blindness or low vision. For intellectual and developmental disabilities, it can include things like autism spectrum disorder or Down syndrome. For cognitive disabilities, it can include things like traumatic brain injury or dyslexia. For psychiatric disabilities, we're looking at things like PTSD or schizophrenia. For invisible or hidden disabilities, it can be things like fibromyalgia, long COVID, diabetes. And for our neurological disabilities, it can be things like seizures or Parkinson's disease. Now, deaf and hard of hearing, for some individuals, they identify this as a disability, but others do not. When we look at faith and religion and spirituality, this is about a deeply personal aspect of one's identity. This looks at one's belief system, their values, their practices, and their connection to something greater than themselves. Gender identity and expression. This is how someone identifies, not necessarily tied to their sex assigned as birth. So we're looking at examples like man, woman, cisgender, transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, gender queer. And when we're looking at gender expression, we're looking at how they express their gender. So we're looking at things like feminine and masculine. Sexual and or romantic orientation. This is defined by the gender or genders that a person is sexually and or romantically attracted to. So examples of that can be lesbian, bisexual, gay, asexual, aromantic, biromantic, queer. When we look at socioeconomic status and class, we look at how one's access to resources and opportunities and power. We also look at how this status is shaped by income and education, occupation, and social environment. Tribal or indigenous affiliation. This one is rooted in ancestral lineage, cultural heritage, and sovereign community that they belong to. This identity is oftentimes connected to specific traditions and languages and historical experiences. First language. This is the language that someone learns to speak first. So if the first language you learned was English, that's your first language. If it was Spanish, that's your first language. Immigration status. So we're looking at things like citizenship, temporary or permanent residence, asylum seeker, refugee, undocumented. And then the last one is body size. Body size is an important identity to add because weight discrimination is oftentimes one of the most ignored prejudice that an individual can face. Now, I want to note that these identity groups have hierarchies set up within them. And these hierarchies stem from our national and our global history. And so within the hierarchy, the identities on the top, so we're talking about from age to skin color, oftentimes are referred to as dominant hierarchies. And the ones at the bottom, so we're talking socioeconomic status to body size, are oftentimes referred to as marginalized identities. And so dominant identities are considered the norm, the standard, the highly valued in our city, in our society. And marginalized identities are seen as abnormal, wrong, and an inconvenience to others. It's also important to know that in the United States, some of these examples of dominant hierarchies or dominant identities are wealthy, Christian, white, able bodied, born in the US, athletic built, and speak English as their first language. People who hold these identities are seen as normal, highly valued, and hold more power as they move through our society. However, those who hold marginalized identities are the ones that are identified as being culturally, historically, systematically, and institutionally oppressed. And so some examples are women, the LGBTQIA plus, indigenous, immigrants, Jewish people, people living in poverty, dark skinned people, fat body people. It's important to know that people who hold marginalized identities do not hold as much power moving through society and may face a lot of barriers throughout life solely because of these identities. So I want to take a moment and hear from you all. In the chat, I want you to tell me, how does aspects of your identity show up when you're working with survivors from underserved populations? It can help you relate depending on your identity marker. Okay, I like it. Think about your identity. How does it show up when you're working with a member of the underserved population? In some cases, it's relaxing and welcomed. Okay. Can make a client feel more comfortable with sharing with you. Yes. Any others? Okay, let's keep going. Oh, one more. You are perceived as being able to identify and empathize. Love it. Makes you more relatable. It can present a challenge, especially if you come from a significantly privileged background. Yes. Some professionals may realize they have biases they need to address. Friendly approach to help the client relax. All great answers. So let's talk about the incarcerated. Let's talk a little bit about incarcerated survivors because they too are underserved population. So why is the incarcerated survivor also underserved populations? When we talk about underserved populations, we need to also consider incarcerated survivors, right? So the PREA or Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed to address sexual violence within correctional facilities and to provide support to those who experience it. It's important to understand that even with these protections, incarcerated survivors are still navigating institutional barriers that make accessing care incredibly difficult. So why PREA? One of my favorite pictures by Just Detention International is this one right here, because it has you to start to think, how would you show up and support someone who looked different than you, who dressed different than you? So if you look at these two images, we have a woman who's in plain clothes and we have a male that's in plain clothes, but then we also have that same person in prison attire. When we look at the woman in plain clothes, we're probably willing to help her, right? She looks like someone that can use our help. But would we have that same experience or that same feeling for someone that was in prison attire? What about for the male? The male in plain clothes? I'm sure we wouldn't joke about being raped or sexually assaulted. But would we have those same conversations, those same jokes if he was in prison attire? So here's the thing, no one deserves to be sexually abused. Every survivor deserves support. Incarcerated survivors are already having issues accessing rehabilitation services, and sexual violence should never be a part of their penalty. All survivors deserve support in their path towards healing, regardless of the environment in which sexual violence occurred. Additionally, regardless of the crime someone may have committed, again, sexual violence and rape should never be a part of their punishment. And so the state takes on the care and safety of the inmates. And part of that care and safety is providing a facility in which these inmates can live and work without experiencing sexual violence. Sexual violence in detention is also a public health issue. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that there's 200,000 people that are sexually abused behind bars every year. And many of those survivors experience more than one sexual violation. And of that 200,000, 10% of them said that they were sexually assaulted during their last period of detention, also known as closer to their release date. So that's where the PREA or Prison Rape Elimination Act came into play. PREA was passed in 2003, and the final standards were issued by the DOJ in 2012. And so the purpose of PREA is to do a few things. One, to establish a zero tolerance standard for incidents of prison rape in the United States prison system. Two, to make the prevention of prison rape a top priority in each prison system. Three, to develop and implement national standards for the detection, prevention, reduction, and discipline when sexual violence occurs. Four, to increase the available data and information on the incidence of prison rape. Five, to improve the management and administration of correctional facilities. Six, to standardize the definitions used for collecting data on the incidence of prison rape. Seven, to increase the accountability of prison officials who fail to detect, prevent, reduce, and punish prison rape. Eight, to protect the Eighth Amendment rights of federal, state, and local prisoners. And lastly, number 9, to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of federal programs that deal with things like healthcare, mental health care, disease prevention, crime prevention, investigation, prosecution, prison construction, maintenance, operations, race relations, poverty, unemployment, and homelessness, as well as reduce the costs that prison rape imposes on interstate commerce. Now, it's important to know that there are different sets of standards for different types of facilities, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. I want to note that the responsibility to comply with PREA falls on an individual agency rather than community mental health providers like rape crisis centers. So when a facility is audited and found out of compliance with PREA, the responsibility to make the changes falls back on the facility and not rape crisis center staff or victim advocates or FNEs. So let's talk a little bit about our facilities. So here in Maryland, we have many relevant agencies. And some of those agencies are the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, Department of Juvenile Services, the county's Department of Corrections, also known as the DOC, and our local police departments. So as I mentioned previously, there are different sets of PREA standards to different types of facilities. And so federal law states that individual states stand to lose federal funding if they do not comply with PREA. Specifically, they will lose 5% of their federal funding if they do not comply. Now, some states have opted out altogether. Others have certified that they will use that money to become PREA compliant. So let's talk a little bit about our facilities. So in our federal prisons, they typically house people after they either been convicted or they have a sentence of a year or more. And so typically our federal prisons are managed by either federal or state governments. Now, our jails are typically housing people who are either waiting for trial or in pre-conviction. Sometimes they house people post-conviction who have shorter sentences, so typically less than a year. Our jails can also house people awaiting transfer to another facility. And so our jails are typically managed by the county or the city. Lockups are typically managed by local law enforcement agencies. And so our lockups are for individuals who are housed for short periods of times, typically about 72 hours. Community corrections are a little bit harder to define because it can take on many forms. So some examples of community corrections can be like a community treatment center, a halfway house, a mental health facility, alcohol or drug rehab, sometimes even our residential reentry centers. And so community confinement is typically used for post-release conditions. And so we typically use community confinement for things like getting employment or employment search efforts, community service, vocational training, treatment, educational programs. Now, in Maryland, it is also important to know that we have four main agencies. Again, it's the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, the Department of Juvenile Services, the County Department of Corrections. Now, immigration detention is oftentimes managed by the federal agency ICE, also known as Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so some state and local facilities may house ICE detainees if there's a contract in place. Now, immigration detention is a civil and an administration detention. It is not criminal. And so because of that, there are a separate set of standards for immigration detainees that were released by the Department of Homeland Security. So I have this scenario. I'm going to first read it to you all, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and I would like you to answer it in the chat. So you're working with a survivor who's currently incarcerated. She identifies as a 30-year-old woman of color and part of the LGBTQIA plus community. She has experienced sexual violence both before and during her time in prison. She's been incarcerated for 5 years now and has very limited access to outside resources. She's coming to you for support because she is feeling isolated and her trauma is worsened due to the environment. She's also concerned about retaliation if she speaks out about the abuse she's experienced while incarcerated. In your role as advocates, how would you provide immediate support to this survivor? I want you to think both short term and long term. How would you support her? Let me know in the chat. What are some things you would do to support this survivor? Let's see what we got. Try hard not to judge. Identify your own bias. Know your limitations. Acknowledge her concerns. Acknowledge, assure that we believe them. Okay. Get assistance with psychological treatment. Listen and believe first. Then ask if they are seeking counseling. Acknowledge their rights. Okay. What else? Acknowledge her concerns and her rights. What would you do long term? Express concern about their mental health and provide options. Seek free resources for free legal services on this matter. Address the safety concerns and resources for the client. Okay. Find support to assist her with housing, employment, and behavioral support. Humanize, just because they're a criminal, they don't need to be victims of a crime. Try to direct them into systems of support. Let her know she's not alone. Provide safe and supportive environment. Address the mental health. Use trauma-informed approaches and provide options. Find programs where the survivor can participate and socialize. Establish rapport and introduce other options she can choose to address safety, reporting, and other means of support. Awesome. Awesome. All right, let's continue. Let's talk about understanding intersectionality. So Audre Lorde said, there is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. So it is important to note that people are not monoliths. No one group is the same because no one person holds just one identity. And that is what intersectionality is about. Intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and a professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School. She coined this term in 1989 to describe the intersection of identities and power. She discussed how a Black man can experience discrimination because he's Black. A white woman can experience discrimination because she's a woman. Yet a Black woman can experience a different type of discrimination because she's both a woman and Black. And so the way her intersecting identities show up gives her a very different life experience than someone who does not experience both of those forms of discrimination at once. Another example can be an organization that has discriminatory hiring practices. And so this organization can hire white women or hire Black men and say stuff like, we're not racist or we're not sexist. But if they refuse to hire Black women, they're being discriminatory in a way that is easier for them to excuse. Because that intersection of our identities and the power associated with those identities impacts how we see the world, how the world sees us, and how we're treated. We also know that there are populations that are underserved not because of their identity, but because of circumstances. And some of those populations are like homeless people or the incarcerated. And so statistically, folks with marginalized identities are more likely to be filtered into these circumstances as well. So someone from an underserved population is someone who holds one or many identities that have been historically and or currently oppressed. So what is oppression? One of the best definitions I've heard of oppression is that it is a perpetual state of disadvantage. Oppression is not something that you can just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Oppression is historic, it's systematic, it is ingrained in our cultural beliefs, our attitudes, and our behaviors. And oftentimes it is traumatic for those who are experiencing it. And we'll talk a little bit about trauma in a few. So, how does oppression show up for a survivor of sexual violence from an underserved population? For an undocumented immigrant, it can look like fear of deportation if he, she, they reports being sexually assaulted by an employer. For a Black woman survivor, it could look like dismissing her pain and downplaying it under this ideology that she did something to cause her sexual assault. Yet historically, Black women have been seen as less vulnerable and less credible, as well as hypersexual. For an indigenous or two-spirited survivor, it could look like not receiving culturally competent services and dismissing he, she, they's cultural beliefs. For a LGBTQIA plus survivor, it can look like not respecting he, she, they's gender expression or misgendering them, which further isolates them. For a disabled survivor, it can look like questioning whether he, she, they can be a victim of sexual assault because they have a disability. And for an incarcerated survivor, it can look like being frequently denied access to proper health care and mental health services. Now, it is important to know that oppression operates in systems of power. People who hold one or many dominant identities are given unearned power in society. And people who hold one or many marginalized identities are rendered powerless. This is how hierarchies work. One group has power, the other is rendered powerless. And so it is important to talk about when we're doing anti-sexual violence work, how power dynamics operate the same way. When someone is victimized by sexual violence, their power is taken from them, while the person who caused the harm is seeking to gain power over them. And so sexual violence is a power-based attack, just as racism, sexism, LGBTQIA, ableism, all of them are forms of power-based violence. And this violence is used to perpetuate oppression to a targeted group. So let's talk about the four elements of oppression. We have defined norms, institutional power, violence and threats of violence, and economic power. So defined norms. This is what society deems normal. So example again is white, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied. Those are the individuals that are seen as the standard. Whereas marginalized groups are oftentimes considered the others because they're deviating from the norm. And so this is where cultural stereotypes come into play because the defined norms have created harmful stereotypes such as hypersexualization or the invisibility of LGBTQI+, which further isolates them. When we look at defined norms, we also have to understand its impact on credibility because survivors that are outside of the defined norm are seen as less credible and less deserving of support and protection. Institutional power. So when we look at oppression from an institutional power standpoint, we look at things like systematic barriers. So we have to look at our legal system, our healthcare system, our social services system that oftentimes favor those who align with the standard, the norm, and marginalize those that fit into the other category. We have to talk about the discrimination that is faced in our justice systems. Marginalized survivors oftentimes face biased policing and court hearings and HR systems that dismiss their claims. We also have to talk about the lack of cultural competence and humility within the institutional systems. Oftentimes, institutions lack the resource and the training to really understand and support the specific needs of marginalized survivors. When we look at violence and threats of violence, we have to talk about the direct violence that marginalized survivors experience higher rates of physical, sexual, emotional, and financial violence due to systematic racism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, as well as the threat of violence. Marginalized survivors have a fear of retaliation from the abuser, a fear of deportation, family and community backlash. And we can't forget the state sanctioned violence, the over policing, the racial profiling, and many other forms of violence that disproportionately impact marginalized communities. And the last element is economic power. So when we look at economic power in oppression, we look at things like limited financial resources. Many survivors from marginalized communities have a lack of access to wealth and economic stability. Workplace vulnerability. Many survivors who fall into our low income or immigrant population face sexual exploitation and other forms of sexual violence and are afraid to report these incidents for fear of losing their job or being deported. Not to mention, poverty is a barrier. So, not being able to afford legal fees or bail or transportation to court. So, my question to you is, what are some of the forms of oppression that you've seen in your line of work as advocates? Let me know in the chat. Poverty, disability, race, age, mhm, race, yep, medical care, race, sex, age, nationality, sexual orientation, income, lack of access to education, religion, religious beliefs, race and sexual orientation. Awesome. Education. Awesome. So now we're going to talk a little bit about rape culture and trauma. So this is the rape cultural pyramid. It was created by the Virginia Sexual Assault Domestic Violence Action Alliance. And it is an incredible visual representation of the way in which oppression is the foundation of sexual violence. So if you look at the structural forms of oppression, this is what cultivates a society in which the attitudes and behaviors and policies that are higher up on that pyramid become prevalent and pervasive. So we cannot do anti-violence work as advocates and not address that homophobia and transphobia and racism and sexism and classism are all the forming blocks that create those additional harmful behaviors and attitudes. So when it comes to sexual violence prevention, we cannot successfully pre- prevent sexual violence without addressing that structural oppression because it's the root of all of the work that we have to do. And it also impacts the services that we provide. So let's talk a little bit about trauma. And so I'm going to break down 5 key traumas that most survivors deal with. But what is trauma? Trauma is a normal response to an abnormal experience. So it's important to know that each survivor reacts to trauma in their own way. Some signs of trauma can be things like flashbacks, triggers, other symptoms of PTSD, substance use, depression, anxiety, numbness, avoidance, hyperarousal, an impacted sense of self, eating disorders, sleep disorders, self harm, and suicidal ideations and attempts. Now, there are several types of trauma, and I'm not going to go through all of them today, but I will highlight specifically these 5. And so we'll talk a little bit about collective trauma, historical trauma, transgenerational trauma, cultural trauma, and structurally induced trauma. And you'll even notice that some of these actually intersect. So, collective trauma is trauma that impacts individuals and groups. So, examples of that can be gender-based violence, institutional racism, colonialization. Historical trauma looks at the emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan of individuals. So, examples of that could be slavery, genocide. Transgenerational trauma studies how trauma can be inherited, so how it's transferred from one generation to another. So, an example of that can be the people that descended from the Holocaust. They were found to have elevated heart rates. Cultural trauma can occur when attempts are made to eradicate part or all of a culture or people. So, examples of that can be Holocaust, white supremacy, assimilation, genocide, and the treatment of indigenous people. Now, also with cultural trauma, there are cultural practices that are created that bring about violations or harm within the culture. So, some examples of that can be things like the female genitalia mutilation, or toxic masculinity, or secrecy within families and churches. Structurally induced trauma is trauma that is created by policies that result in unjust, abusive, racist, homophobic, or unsafe systems that causes hardship, oftentimes long term and continuous. So, examples of that can be the prison industry, or our policies about the border, or capitalism. Now, it's important to know that these traumas are important to keep in mind because when an individual survives a sexual assault, they may be dealing with trauma after the event. However, if they are a marginalized identity, they're already living with these traumas. Many of them are already living with cultural trauma and transgenerational trauma. And so these compounding traumas will impact their ability to seek help, to navigate support systems, and their ability to heal from what has happened to them. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the potential barriers to accessing and accepting support services. Again, no community is monolith, right? Everyone deals with barriers, everyone experiences barriers in their own way. And so a lot of these barriers are oftentimes what keeps people from feeling seen, from feeling heard, and from being able to get the help that they need. So in the chat, let me know what are some barriers that may prevent a survivor with a marginalized identity from seeking services? Won't be believed. Mistrust. Yes. Stigma. What else? Fear of retribution, judgment. I love it. Fear of being taken advantage of. Yes. Stigma. Culture. Lack of culturally competent services. Love it. Love it. Love it. So let's talk about the barriers to accessing services. Now, the way I like to explain these types of barriers is that these are the barriers that keep survivors from underserved populations from coming through our organization's doors. And so we're going to talk about it from both a community standpoint as well as what it feels like to them when they're working with advocates. So some of the community barriers they face are lack of trust in the system. Many survivors from marginalized communities have a understanding of the historical harm, systematic racism, and even their own negative past experiences with institutions. And so because of that, there is this fear or this hesitancy that keeps them from coming through your doors. Cultural insensitivity. Many of the services that our organizations may provide are not tailored to their unique lived experiences. And so they don't think about language, they don't think about cultural norms, they don't think about cultural beliefs. And so many survivors may feel seen, but they don't feel understood. Stigma and shame, right? Many of our survivors feel that they're going to be judged. And so, because of that judgment, because of silence within our communities, right, about sexual violence, about mental health, all of those things outweigh their desire to seek help. And then we have accessibility and visibility. Oftentimes, the reason why they're not walking through our doors is because they may not know you exist. Or they're dealing with additional barriers such as transportation and childcare and technology, right? Making it hard for them to get to you and hard to build that trust. So, what does it feel like when they're working with advocates when they show up at your doors? Well, for many of them, it can feel like performative allyship. Marginalized survivors can feel like that advocates may say all the right words, but fail to act on them, which leaves them feeling very much like you're just checking a box versus building trust. It can also feel like lack of cultural competency. So again, I feel seen, but you don't understand me. You don't understand how trauma shows up differently for me, which leaves them with the burden of having to constantly explain or justify their reality. Assumptions and bias. Many survivors oftentimes feel as though the advocates believe that everyone processes trauma the same way. And so this standard one size fit all approach makes them feel invisible and invalidated. And then tokenization instead of inclusion, right? So some survivors feel like organizations want to work with them, but again, it's to check a box and not really to partner with them. And so it sends this message that while their voices are present, their power is not. Sorry. And let's talk a little bit about accepting services. So these are the barriers that keep them from staying. So now you got them through their doors, but how do we engage? So from a community standpoint, again, it's that stigma and that shame, right? If you grew up like I grew up, I always used to hear what happens in this house stays in this house, right? So it's a culture of silence. Or don't go down there and get them people in our business, right? Again, it's that distrust in the legal system. Understand that as advocates, you all represent the system. So it's not personal when a survivor from an underserved population is struggling to work with you. You're a representation of a system. Cultural barriers, again, that secrecy in the household. We don't talk about it. Historical trauma, right? Many people of color have been experimented on. And so understand that they're coming in your doors with that. Gender and sexual orientation stigmas. Are you going to misgender me? And then inadequate healthcare systems. Many of our healthcare systems are not set up, are not trained to handle those from marginalized communities. And so when working with advocates, it can feel like lack of representation. If I'm a person of color, when I walk through your doors, am I going to see someone that looks like me beyond the reception desk? What about economic disparities? The fact that I'm not even earning a livable wage. And so I got to decide between do I go get help or do I keep a roof over my head? Which one do you think I'm going to decide? Institutional barriers, right? Such as lack of proper procedures, or you're going to not believe me, or maybe I'm going to face retaliation if I say something. Language barriers. If I'm a member of the deaf and hard of hearing, do you have ASL available to interpret? Or do I have to wait for you to go get somebody that can talk to me? stereotypes, right? Because we all have our own bias. And so they feel it when they come in your organization's doors. And then lack of trauma-informed care. Do you really understand what trauma looks like for me, or are you still going to do this very generic one-size-fit-all approach? So now let's talk a little bit about incarcerated survivors because they face barriers too. From a community standpoint, incarcerated survivors are facing judgment, which leads to that shame. Yes, they know that they committed a crime, but they still deserve to be believed. They still deserve to be supported because sexual violence is not a part of the punishment. Again, a mistrust in that justice system. They have a deep mistrust for both the justice system and community resources. So again, it's not personal. But we have to take into consideration the history of discrimination, the history of mistreatment, isolation and alienation, right? Because they're incarcerated, they're already isolated from their community. So they feel even further alienated, have limited access to their family and support networks. Criminalization of the victimhood. Incarcerated survivors are sometimes seen as more as perpetrators than victims, which means sexual violence is oftentimes overlooked or minimized. Cultural and family expectations. So survivors from certain culture or familiar backgrounds may feel pressured to remain silent. And again, that economic and social disconnection. Because once they're released, many survivors are still struggling to reintegrate into their communities because they have a lack of resources or a lack of a support system. So, what does it feel like when they're working with advocates? It feels like a lack of confidentiality. If I speak up, if I share what I'm experiencing behind these prison bars, are you going to judge me? Limited access to advocacy services. So, because of things like institutional oppression, they have a lack of resources, limiting access to external advocates or support programs. Language and communication barriers. So, for survivors who are non English speaking or have a disability, how are they able to communicate effectively when they're working with advocates? The fear of retaliation. Many of them know that advocates cannot fully protect them. And so again, if I share what is I'm experiencing, I now have to face being punished or retaliated against, especially if the perpetrator is prison staff or a fellow inmate. That cultural and racial disconnect. Oftentimes, advocates are not trained in cultural sensitivity. And so they don't understand those unique needs of incarcerated survivors. And then bureaucratic challenges. So we know that the prison system has a lot of rigid, structural, and complex policies and paperwork that oftentimes delay or deny that access to support that incarcerated survivors need. So, real quick, what are some actionable steps that you can take to address some of these barriers that survivors from incarcerated or underserved populations face? Let me know in the chat. What are some steps you can take? What can you do? Listen without judgment, advocate for them, continuously educate yourself, make them feel comfortable. Yes. Be curious respectfully. I love it. All right. So as we begin to wrap up, let's talk about moving forward. We know the old way of doing things doesn't work. So what does the new way look like? So let's talk about the socio-ecological model. And so the socio-ecological model looks at all the different levels of influence from individual all the way to policy. But also in these levels are things like discrimination and oppression and microaggressions. So, as you're reflecting on how you can make your work more inclusive to people of all identities, I want you to consider each level of the model. Because many times we get stuck in just the individual or maybe even the interpersonal levels. But to really have structural change and to remove systematic oppression, we must look beyond those first two levels and consider the changes that can be made on all levels. So, on the individual level, we look at things like knowledge and attitudes and skills. So, some examples of that can be avoiding assumptions, right? Being aware of your implicit bias. Don't assume that you know everything about one community, right? It can also look like making sure that you have multiple resources prepared when working with survivors. Focusing on the trauma, not their identity. Validating their identity and their experience. Avoiding asking personal questions unless it is necessary. Asking the survivor what information is okay to share and who can they share it with. And using simple language. It can also look like understanding when a survivor's response might be different than your own. It also means preparing that survivors may be frustrated with the system, and that system includes you. It can also look like understanding that trauma looks different for everyone. Now, from an interpersonal level, we're looking at our social networks, our families, our friends. And so that can look like making sure that we're reading and watching and listening to marginalized voices, that we're getting involved in our communities and our campuses, that we're utilizing our social medias to really get an understanding of the marginalized populations that are around us and not solely getting it from mainstream media. From institutional standpoint, we're looking at our organizations and our schools and our workplaces. So, do we have multiple ways in which someone can communicate with us? Are we utilizing interpreters and other resources for people who speak various languages? Do people know what to expect when they come through our doors? Are we gathering the data about who we serve? Are we paying attention to who we hire? Are we looking at our paperwork and our forms? Are we also being clear about the limitations in our organization, what we can and cannot do? Are we being inclusive? Are we making sure that our policies and procedures allow people to name their different identities? What about our physical space? Are we making sure that it is accessible for people with disabilities or people with sensory issues? For our website, are we making sure that it is user-friendly and easily accessible? Do we have access to hotlines and other text options? And in our community, we're looking at our cities and our neighborhoods and the resources and the norms. So are we making sure that we're doing outreach to different communities and spaces? Are we collaborating with other organizations both on and off our campuses? Are we ensuring that there are transportation options to and from our office? And are we working with local officials to advocate for more inclusive laws? And then in the policy, we're looking at state, local, and federal legislation. So are we voting both in local elections as well as the national? Are we advocating for positive and inclusive and trauma-informed legislation? Are we working with our student government on campus? And are we building relationships with those who are called to represent us in this country? So let's talk a little bit about equity. I love this image because it gives you a comparison of what equality versus equity looks like. So if you look at equality, it shows four people with the same exact bike, right? So this means that they're all being treated equally. They all have access to the same resources, right? But the problem is they're not accommodating of the individual's needs. Because as you see, there's someone that's in a wheelchair, right? And then you see there's someone that's really tall. And so equity, right, shows the same individuals, each on different bikes. They're not all given the same exact resources. They're given what they need based on their needs. We have to remember people are not one size fit all. And so I know you are probably thinking we've done it this way for the last few years and it just seems to work. But who is it really working for? Because there are a lot of people that now have to jump through extra hoops to get it to work. And so, in order to be equitable, sometimes that looks like we got to get creative. We got to get creative with our resources and our policies and our paperwork and our support services and the money and where we spend our money. We have to think critically and be proactive. We also have to be more inclusive, right, in our interactions, right, in the way we set up our organizations, in the legislation that we back. Equality is about treating others how we want to be treated. Equity is about treating others how they want to be treated. So, to close us out, I want to hear from you one last time. What are some of the things that you're going to take away from today's training? Let me know in the chat. Work on legislation for equality and equity, equity versus equality, always be considerate of individuals' lived experiences and the barriers they face. Nice. Any others? Advocate for incarcerated victims. I love it. To be more intentional about other circumstances that play a part in a victim situation. Transparency. Yes. Awesome. Awesome. So I want to leave you guys to let you know that in my presentation, you can find more information about other underserved populations. So I have a few listed. Dawn is one of our community partners that works with the deaf and hard of hearing community. We have 1 in 6, which focuses on male survivors. Free State Justice, who focuses on the LGBTQIA. We also have the Intercultural Counseling, who focuses on refugees and immigrants. Safe Sisters Circle, which is a nonprofit that focuses on helping Black women and girls. And then the Human Trafficking Prevention Project, which focuses on those in Maryland impacted by human trafficking. I also leave you all with some supplemental learning. So MCASA, we have an incredible online training library that you can go check out, various different topics, as well as some other videos and podcasts that you all can listen to. Again, it's been an honor to serve you all. I'm Leah Forney. I am the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate here at MCASA. And so I'll pass it over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. So I put the evaluation link into the chat. If you're seeking a certificate of attendance, you must fill out the evaluation form. If you are in the military and have trouble accessing the form, feel free to email me and we'll do a workaround. I'll be sending a follow-up email later today with a copy of the slides, the evaluation link, and today's video recording. We hope to see you this afternoon for a session on safety planning. And if you're unable to make it, then we hope to see you tomorrow for our last morning training session. Thank you.